In this video, we're going to talk about direct color mixing for a still life. If this is your first time doing a color painting, then hopefully there's some transitions that we can talk about that helps move from a black and white painting, which we did previously, to what we're doing now in color. The first step is I want to lay down a pencil line drawing. And in this line drawing, I'm trying to show the difference between color changes, but also value changes. So this is very shape-based, but in every time I'm drawing a line, I'm showing that there's a change of hue, saturation, or value. After I feel satisfied with the drawing, I'm going to cover that with a spray fixative. That's going to seal the drawing in place, keep it from smudging, and as I add the next step, it's going to make sure that the drawing is still visible from underneath. So what I'm doing right now is I'm covering the painting with a wash. This wash is made by mixing 80% solvent and 20% paint. It allows the paint to move very well, and it's very translucent, so you can see the line drawing from underneath. When first putting on this wash, I highly recommend doing this first in a corner of the painting where if it starts to smudge, it's not going to be such a big deal. So start there and start to move it onto the drawing, and if it looks okay, then you can start to slowly brush that elsewhere. As you progress, it's a great idea to move the brush strokes so that it covers the entire painting, but you're still watching underneath to make sure that the line drawing is still intact. Use strong, even strokes, vertical at first, and then move horizontal until the entire painting is covered. Once this is covered, then you should let it dry for 24 hours. Before we go on, I want to show an alternative to that first step, where we're laying down the drawing and then the wash on top of it. In this case, you can lay down the wash first, and then let that dry for 24 hours, and then you can draw on top of the surface. The benefit of doing these steps in reverse, where you lay down your wash and let it dry for 24 hours, is that there's not going to be any smudging, as with the first layering. But if you do have your drawing on top of the brown wash, you can't do any erasing. That's going to pull up the brown wash, and it's going to make that surface no longer as flat, as it were. So on this image, I have my drawing down, I put my wash on top, and then I've allowed 24 hours of drying time. Before I go on to the actual painting, I want to talk about what colors we will use and which colors we won't use. And this will happen in two different stages. The first stage is a low saturation stage. I'm using yellow ochre, ultramarine blue, and burnt sienna, where I'm not using Hansa yellow, cerulean blue, and cadmium red light. I will eventually use those colors, but that's on the second layer of painting. The first layer is more of a value-based approach. So I'm using these earthy colors to lay down the approximate color, but in a black and white fashion. I'm also using liquid so that I can have a fair amount of drying time between that first layer and second layer. So recap, I'm using black and white, burnt umber, and then my low saturation palette, yellow ochre, ultramarine blue, and burnt sienna. In this technique, we're going to mix as many colors as we can before we start painting. This is different than doing a wet and wet technique where you're putting down a color and you're mixing it on the canvas. We're going to do a lot of the mixing here on the palette before it makes its way to the canvas. With color mixing, it's not that often that I'll use a color right out of the tube. It just won't happen. Instead, I'm taking a little bit of each color and I'm starting to mix what I see in front of me. So I'm going to see something that's a little bit red, a little bit blue, a little bit yellow, and then everything in between. I'm looking for lighter and darker versions of all those colors as well. So while there might be hue change, there's also value change. And then lastly, saturation, which is bright and dull. In order to mix some of those bright and dull colors, what I'm doing is I'm using black and white. And black and white will move the color out of the mix by tinting, toning, or shading that color. So the more black, white, or gray I mix into it, the less colorful that color will be. One approach is to consider every subject that's within the still life and to think about the local color or the natural pigmentation of that particular subject. And then imagine if there's a lighter version and then a darker version, and there might be a slightly more warm and slightly more cool version of that subject. And then we have areas where it can fall into more color and less color. So because of this, every subject might have its natural coloration, but the colors that we see could be many more. If nothing else, have a light, a mid-tone, and a dark for every subject within the still life. And then lastly, I want to add that this is only the first layer, so don't feel like you need to achieve every single color you see. We're laying down a foundation or an approximation of the colors that are needed. So when we do get to the more colorful stage or the second layer of the painting, then it's going to have something really nice to rest on top of. We don't have to do this all in one shot. And just like the last painting, we're going to mix about a 10 to 15% liquid mix into each color that's been mixed on the palette. But remember to do this only after you've mixed all your colors on your palette. Don't do it before the color mixing takes place. Okay, just like before, I'm going to use controlled, even brushstrokes. I'm grabbing a color from my palette, I'm deciding where I want to drop that color in, and then I'm counting brushstrokes, just like before. With this painting, I'm starting with my darks, so I'm not using my whites prematurely. That's just a preference of mine because I think it's easier to go from dark to light than it is necessarily going from light to dark. Also, early on, I'm not using very small brushes. I'm using a medium to large brush, relatively sized to the canvas that I'm working on. This forces me to think about bigger shapes, and it forces me to think about the direction and the controlled brush strokes that I want to lay down. Again, as I'm doing this, I'm counting each move. So I'm changing the direction, the brush stroke, I'm changing the potential color, but then I'm also not moving it around to make it into a flat shape. I want these brush strokes to still have a presence in my final piece, and I can always blend later if I choose to do so. As I'm painting, I want to form a strategy where I'm not completing one object and then moving on to the next. Instead, I want to grab a color from my palette and I want to start dropping that in to the painting wherever it exists. So there might be a red object that has a dark brown, but I'm not just sticking to that one object. I'm looking at where else does that dark brown happen within the still life and dropping it in and then kind of moving on. In the last painting, which was the black and white painting, we talked about thinking of these almost like pixels. So if you imagine that you're grabbing a particular color, think of where those pixels happen, and then you can start to move them around a little bit. I want to talk a little bit about that brown wash that we laid down at the beginning of the painting, and really the purpose that it serves as we're doing this technique. There's a few reasons. One is it allows us to react against something. So by having a white surface, we're more likely to not put down white paint or not put it on heavy enough. And so the brown allows us to put down some heavier whites, first of all. Number two is that there might be some areas where we allow that brown to show through. And it might be really interesting if we layer the paint on top of it, allowing some of this underneath tone or the brown wash to still have a presence. I want to talk a little bit more about paint application. I think a lot about cross contour paint strokes. So for example, if I have a very tall vertical element like the hammer, my habit or my natural inclination might be to use vertical strokes to make that object. But every so often it's nice to come in and move horizontally against the grain, so that adds something new to the piece, adds a sense of surprise. And if you're not doing this for the first layer, the second layer is a great place to do this, so that you can come in and make some very conscious efforts about moving against your first move. So if you have a horizontal for the first layer, now try going vertical on top of that. So at this time, I've been working for about an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours, just to worry about coverage. Again, this is a value-based approach, so I'm not getting exact colors, but I do want to get the basic temperature of those areas. With the liquid that I added, it'll take about 24, maybe 36 hours to dry. At that time, I'm going to come back in and mix more exact colors using my high saturation palette, and I'll be able to get some more details in. But again, the main component of this first layer is to help lay out where those major blocks of value and color happen. So by looking at this first layer, you're able to make some adjustments in terms of the drawing or the composition before you get too involved with the exact color that happens later on. Okay, this is day 2 of the painting. I've given my painting a chance to dry. I'm starting to mix some colors, and as you can see, I am using a high saturation palette, using all the colors at my disposal, not just the earth tones that I was using earlier. The same as before, I'm using 3 or 4 colors for every object, but this time I'm using my photo reference to match them a little bit more closely to what I see in real life. So I'm putting some colors on my palette knife, moving that around, and when that color disappears, it tells me a little bit about how that color is going to match that particular area. I like this technique because, as you can see, the cloth on the left side is a little bit more orange, where the cloth on the right side has more of a maroon, cold feeling to it. So I can't use the same red, and to get it as exact as possible, I'm being very mindful to mix one side more towards the yellow and one that's more towards the blue. Something else I'm going to do before I start going back into painting is I just want to check structure, and in doing so I'm using my original drawing and holding a photocopy in front of my painting. And by flipping that up and down, I'm able to check to see if my drawing is still intact, and I can make some minor corrections while I'm painting. I'm now going to start layer 2. Layer 2 is going to be very similar to layer 1. I'm starting with my darks, but the main difference right now is when I mixed my darks, I added a little bit more liquid into those than my midtones and my highlights. The reason for the liquid is I want the dark tones to be a little bit more see-through, so that when they're layered on top, they're not just covering that first layer, but they're starting to combine in with that first layer. For the darks, the liquid mix is not that much different. Instead of a 15% mix or a 10% mix, it's just up to about 25%. So It still very much has a body to it. It's a little bit thick, but it's just to the point that you can slightly see through once you add it to the first layer. While I'm putting down some paint for the darks, most of my efforts are going to be for the midtones and the highlights. The reason for this is that when light activates an area, when we think about bright color, it doesn't happen in the shadows. It's going to happen in the areas where the light hits, being the midtones and into the highlight areas. So while I'm still using a brush to lay down the blocks of color like I did in the first layer, I'm going to do a couple other things where I use a stencil approach if I need a straight line. So I might lay down a piece of paper and then paint against that to achieve those straight lines that I need. The other thing I'll do is I'll periodically use a palette knife. I do this to get a slightly different touch, and I do this to add thicker paint, primarily in the highlight areas that are foreground elements. Even though in this demo I'm doing two layers, one that is a low saturation approach and one that is a high saturation layer after that, yours could take more than two. It's always okay to come back in and start to edit in the way that you're looking for high contrast, you're looking for subtleties, looking for detail. Don't feel like you need to stop simply because you achieve those two layers. You can always do more to it. Okay, as I end things off, I just want to return to that idea of editing. I really like that idea that we're starting something and it's not going to be perfect right away. But we are able to go into it again and again and make modifications the same way that you can write a paper, and every decision you make gets it closer to the ideal or the perfect paper that it could be. So as you finish things off, don't worry if it's not totally correct. It's totally okay to let things dry and go back into it. And while you're working, my best advice is just remember to continue squinting while you're looking at the subject and comparing it to your painting. That should do, and I'll see you next time.